There's been a lot of discussion recently in the news about the idea of Canada using more nuclear power. Here at secondstreet.org, we were curious about that, especially when it comes to reducing emissions. What kind of power would this really be? So we contacted the Canadian Nuclear Association. They're going to help us understand what small modular reactors look like. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Chris.
Can you just give us a brief overview of nuclear power here in Canada? What does it look like and how many sites do we have?
Sure. Canada has been a nuclear technology country since very early days. Sir Ernest Rutherford, a famous British early researcher on radioactivity, did his early career in Montreal, and that was the genesis of Canada's nuclear research establishment around 1905, 1910. In fact, he got a Nobel Prize for that work. Since then, we've always had a nuclear research laboratory, or several. When we started to run out of good hydro sites in Ontario in the 50s, and it was clear that demand for electric power was growing very rapidly, Ontario started looking for another solution for large baseload electric power generation. The remaining sites were just too far away. So they went for nuclear. And they developed a uniquely Canadian technology called the CANDU reactor technology. We sold that to 6 other countries, including China, India, and Korea. And it's used successfully in all those countries. In Canada, Ontario, which is a huge jurisdiction, I mean, it's 12 or 13 million people now, I think, at least. Must be more than that these days. It gets 60 or 62% of its electric power from nuclear.
Wow.
That's 18 reactors at 3 different sites. New Brunswick also gets about 30% of its electric power from nuclear, from 1 reactor. And they export a significant amount of power to neighboring state of Maine. On top of that, there are reactors at 6 or so universities in Canada, or there have been, or research reactors at different locations. About 6 universities and a couple of research laboratories have research reactors, which are far smaller and aren't connected to the power grid.
What do small modular reactors look like? Because that was the language that we heard most recently coming from some of the premiers of Western provinces here in Canada. They were talking about small modular reactors. Can you describe those for us?
Sure. Well, a reactor can be any size. And when reactors were first created in the late 30s, early 40s, they were extremely simple. They were basically just piles of the right mix of fissile material, uranium and other material, put together in a way that you could get a reaction going, almost like a composter. But gradually systems were added to manage that reaction, to control its speed, to extract the heat from it, to make it safe, to contain the radioactivity. And just like cars and planes have gotten more complex over the years from a basic, simple design, reactors are a complicated machine, and they've done the same thing. As the decades have gone on, we've added systems to them, we've scaled them up, and they're now fairly large, complex systems. But a small reactor, you can still make them small, and there's no reason why you can't make them small. Just as there's no reason why you can't make a small, simple airplane or a small, simple car. It's just that that's not how we do it most of the time. Examples of small, simple reactors are all around us. They exist on university campuses. University of Alberta had one until a couple of years ago. Saskatchewan Research Council has one. There's a couple in Ontario. There's one at Polytechnique, and was one at Dalhousie University in Halifax. So they're around. They're used in research laboratories, again, usually fairly small and simple. But those aren't particularly modular. Those reactors were built on site, and people and materials went to the site to build them. And the problem with building things on site, and you get this in all kinds of infrastructure, is that it gets kind of expensive, especially these days. If you send people out to the highway interchange and pour all the concrete there and weld all the steel there, you get a fairly expensive bridge. If you can modularize that, if you can build major sub-assemblies in some controlled environment where you're less exposed to the weather, the workers don't have to travel as far, inspectors can do their job more efficiently, all those things, there's utilities available on site, all that stuff, you lower costs. So infrastructure construction has tended to go in that direction. And that's what you're trying to do with a modular reactor. You're trying to build more of it in a factory, less of it on the site. An example
Go ahead.
of where that's done is small reactors are used to push marine vessels around. 9 different navies in the world use reactors to push big marine vessels around quietly and without emissions. That's generally done by militaries, but not exclusively. There have been cases where reactors were used to push cargo ships. Icebreakers are a common example. So, and those are much more modular. They're designed to be actually pulled out of the ship and replaced or serviced. So that's really the operating example of a really modular small reactor.
That's really interesting. And so for the layman to understand what is meant by modular, we could maybe compare this to, say, modular housing, where a lot of the pieces are built off-site at a major climate-controlled warehouse and then put together quickly on-site, or say bridge pieces, as you just mentioned. Sometimes these brilliant engineers can actually install these prefabricated pieces in a matter of a few days, whereas before it would have taken many weeks on-site. Is that a fair comparison?
That's a good comparison. To take it further, with a modular reactor, well, the vision is often something more like a battery. You know, imagine you were going to power, a radio, but you just built a little block of lead and graphite into it, and acid, and you couldn't remove that battery. Once that battery was depleted, it was depleted, and you had to take the radio apart. You want something that's replaceable, that can very simply be popped in, popped out. It doesn't hurt you. There may be hazardous material inside it, but it's so well contained that you can let any consumer use it. The battery is the vision. Another good example, because if you make them really small and really modular, they can be used for many applications and by anyone. So a good example would be moving from a mainframe computer that was the size of a large room to laptop computers that any school kid can use, that doesn't overheat, doesn't leak anything. You can trust your kid at home with it. Content issues aside, of course, but something that's very operable and can be applied to all kinds of things that you never use the mainframe computer for.
That is just fascinating. Do we have any examples of these modular units working right now in Canada? And
Not in Canada.
the potential. What kind of power could they produce for us? Could it be a couple of homes, a neighborhood, a city?
You'd make them to a size that suited the need. There are visions of 2 or 3 major sizes categories. If you want to put them on the power grid, for example, in Saskatchewan, a 200 megawatt coal plant is reaching the end of its life somewhere in Saskatchewan, and you want something non-emitting, you can make them about the same size as the coal plant was. So if you're taking off 160 or 200 megawatts of coal, you want a small reactor that's around that size, or 2 that are half that size. There's a smaller category that would power a small, remote, isolated town. So communities in Canada's Arctic, which typically have 500 to 1,000 people, that's about a 1 megawatt reactor, maybe a little less, 0.6 to 1 megawatt. And then in between there, there's a more ambiguous class of industrial applications where you want to melt bitumen out of the oil sands, or you want to power a very large remote mine site that's or from the ground somewhere in Labrador. There you'd actually look at the specific needs of that industrial site. How much of it is electricity? How much heat does it need? How much do those things vary over time? Does the demand for electricity vary a lot over the daily cycle, or is it relatively flat? And you'd try to get a reactor that matched the needs of that industrial site.
See, this is just fascinating, and I think it's really interesting that these Western premiers are talking about this. How does this apply to things like carbon emissions? So how would one of these small modular sites, or a larger modular site, depending on what you want to call it, how would this form of nuclear power compare for carbon emissions for, let's say, a coal plant, something like that?
Right. Well, nuclear does not emit carbon while it's operating. Right? It doesn't. There's virtually nothing in the way of atmospheric emissions. You're getting solid waste instead.
Okay.
Now, operation of the plant is not the only environmental footprint, right? There's the question of how much land it uses, and that's roughly the same. A nuclear plant occupies roughly the same land footprint that a coal plant or or a gas plant would.
Hmm.
And in both cases, to construct them, you have to pour concrete and drive trucks around and so on. So there's going to be emissions in the construction process. But
Yes.
people who study life cycle emissions usually ignore that because they're similar enough processes. What matters is that once you start operating the thing, you're not getting GHG emissions. And more importantly, you're not getting local air pollution, which is a big health hazard for human beings that live in coal burning jurisdictions. Um, rates of asthma have gone down in Ontario since Ontario got off of coal. That's a material health benefit, quite apart from the climate challenge, quite apart from GHGs.
Hmm.
And that really matters. Gas is a problem too, but less extremely so than coal.
Very much so. You brought up the issue of solid waste that comes from nuclear power or nuclear reactors. Can you describe that for us? And how do we make sure that we manage that sort of waste safely here in Canada?
Right. Well, managing solid waste is a pretty similar problem, whether you're talking about, household municipal waste
Hmm.
or ready spent fuel from a power plant and parts from a power plant. But the nuclear problem is actually a little better in that you know exactly what it is.
Yes.
Municipal solid waste, not only is it in much higher volumes and it's being produced by millions of people instead of one utility, but you don't know what's in it.
Mhm.
Even the householder who's dragging the bag out to the curb doesn't really know what's in that bag. He doesn't know what people in his household have thrown into it in the bathroom. Are there used pharmaceuticals, for example? Are there solvents? Are there old batteries? Did the kids remember to put that stuff in the hazardous waste bin for the spring collection or not? You don't know. But the stuff that comes out of an Ontario power generation nuclear plant is very highly characterized. You know what it is. And more importantly, the spent fuel can be reused. Most of the energy is still in it. And we're now designing small reactors that would simply reformulate and reuse the fuel that's coming out of conventional plants.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. I don't think a lot
Yeah,
of
we know
people
how
do
to
that.
do that, and it's pretty clear that we can do it. So there's not much question that that's what future smaller reactors, especially the advanced designs, that's what they're going to burn.
Wow. That just sounds fascinating. And so going forward, very briefly, how do we make sure we don't have big cost overruns when we're building a nuclear plant? Is it because we could make them smaller and modular that we'd have more control over those sorts of expenses? How would we make sure that we don't have big cost overruns?
Right. It's very similar to cost overruns with infrastructure generally. There are international studies that look at this problem of overrunning costs because it's a problem for governments and public organizations all over the world, public-private partnerships. When you build a highway interchange out, a long way from things, when you build,
Mhm.
subway tunnels, when you build a hydro dam, very good example,
Yes.
uh, you always have these problems. It comes up over and over again. Part of it is the direct cost, the what you'd call the overnight cost. And part of it is the fact that the project takes a long time and is subject to various kinds of delays, sometimes due to political or regulatory hiccups, not always.
Yes.
And those things multiply the interest cost on that overnight capital expenditure. So that inflates things. So for example, well-known case, Darlington nuclear plant in Ontario, um, the addition of interest rate costs because the project got pushed back was a huge contributor to the cost escalation in that plant. If you modularize and build things in a factory and they're coming off a production line of sorts, even if the numbers aren't huge, like large airliners, you're not building millions of them, but you're building enough of them that you've got a production line. You could deliver them closer to the time when the customer is ready to start putting it in service.
Hmm.
Um, you start to remove a lot of those costs and you start to get the efficiency of manufacturing much higher because it's happening under a roof somewhere with all of the services coming to a central place where the workers are every day. And the economics start to get a lot better.
Wow, that sounds very hopeful. And lastly, you mentioned the fuel that is used. How do you make sure that the fuel is transported in a safe manner? Can you explain some of that?
Right. Well, the fuel comes from Saskatchewan, right? Uranium is widely distributed in nature. It's all over the place in the crust of the earth, but it's not in concentrations
Hmm.
that you can mine, except in a few places. And one of those places, fortunately, is Saskatchewan, which has the richest uranium reserves in the world. Um, very, very strong concentrations of the stuff.
Hmm.
So Saskatchewan has a fantastic industry. So it needs to be milled which happens in Saskatchewan, and then it needs to be, processed and converted, which happens in different parts of Ontario, and then it gets manufactured into fuel, and it goes into the reactor in Ontario or New Brunswick. The materials are transported under regulations that are set by Transport Canada and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. All kinds of hazardous waste have to be transported, right? So various kinds of things are transported around our country, often in liquid form. Nuclear waste and nuclear fuel are almost always solid, and there are standard container types and trucking standards and security requirements around transporting that. And that's why there's never really been an incident. I mean, this stuff has been transported around Canada since the 40s.
I was going to say for many decades, yes.
Right. And there hasn't been, an incident that harmed people or the environment. So we've got a pretty good record.
This just sounds fascinating. For any of our viewers and listeners who want to learn more about the future of especially the small modular reactors, where can they go to find out more information? And what would you recommend they do or say with their elected representatives if they want to see this kind of power expanded here in Canada?
Well, a great place to look is the CNA website, cna.ca, Canadian Nuclear Association. Another good one is smrroadmap.ca. That was a multi-stakeholder, federal, provincial, territorial, industry exercise a couple of years ago to map out what small modular reactors might mean for Canada, what the opportunity is, what the problems are. I think the important thing, if you want to advocate for this kind of thing, is decide what your goal is. Because I see it all the time, and we see people sort of lose sight of what the original objective was, and the end becomes the means. Yes. And, that happens in renewable energy, where people sort of lose sight of, were they trying to clean the air? Were they trying to clean the air locally? Were they trying to get less GHGs? Were they trying to be independent of the grid? They never articulated, or were they trying to, just to have personal control of their own power, or what were they trying to do? And often if you look back, they never really articulated that.
No.
So I would say, think about what it is you want. Are you trying to get greenhouse gas emissions down? Are you trying to get local air quality up? Are you trying to get cheaper electric power? Articulate what you want to yourself and make that decision. And then, I didn't grow up in nuclear. I got into nuclear because nuclear delivers certain things, right? And my boss is the same way. He didn't grow up in nuclear. He got into nuclear because nuclear delivers certain things. What is it you want delivered? I think nuclear delivers great things, but, let's articulate what they are. They're low GHG emissions. They're very low land use, okay? And they're a highly manageable, highly characterized waste stream that can be reburned later. And they produce, if you do it right, quite affordable electric power. Because Ontario gets pretty reasonable electric power costs. Ontario's had affordable electric power ever since they started nuclear, and before that, because a hydro and nuclear-based system is not only incredibly reliable, but it's incredibly clean and it's pretty affordable. So work out what you want, and if nuclear can do it, then we're here for you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.